Good morning, everyone. My name is Gene Martin, and I have the privilege of serving as Executive Director of the New Hampshire Fiscal Policy Institute. And we're going to get started. I know folks are still joining us, but want to respect everyone's time. Just as a reminder, NHFPI is a nonpartisan independent research policy nonprofit that examines the state budget, revenue policy, health and education funding policies, the state economy overall, and the economic security of grant staters, with a particular focus with people with low and moderate incomes. We produce regular reports on the fiscal and economic challenges facing New Hampshire, and we strive to be a resource to anyone who's interested in meeting those challenges in a fair and sound fashion. We don't lobby for any issue or cause. Our goal is to provide objective data analysis to policymakers and community leaders, journalists, and the general public. And one of the many ways that we do that is by hosting our state budget webinar series. So thank you so much for joining the second installment as we understand the House Finance Budget Proposal. NHFPI offers our webinar series at no cost to attendees, thanks to the generous underwriting of our series sponsors who see the value in this public good. A special thank you to this year's series presenting sponsor, the Sidor Group of Stewart Partners, as well as our event presenting sponsors, the New Hampshire Hospital Association and Waypoint, in addition to other supporters listed on the screen. Thank you so much. And just as a reminder, I know it seems like a ways off, but we hope that you'll mark your calendar for our final event in the budget webinar series, which will be on Monday, June 12th at 10:30. And folks will drop the link in the chat so you can register for that if you haven't already. And now I'd like to, before I turn this over to our research director, Phil Sletten, friendly reminder, please submit any questions you have using the Q&A feature. And we've set 30 minutes aside at the end of this presentation for Q&A. So look forward to hearing your questions. Thanks so much.
All right, thank you, Gene, and thank you everyone for joining us this morning. And today we're going to focus on the differences between the governor's budget proposal and the House Finance Committee's proposal. In our webinar in February, we focused on the differences between the governor's budget proposal and the current state budget. We'll refer to some of those differences in this presentation as well, but this presentation will be really focused on the differences between the governor's budget proposal and the House Finance Committee's proposal. I would encourage you to take a look, if you haven't already, at our webinar in February and also at our issue brief on the governor's state budget proposal. That really outlines in detail where the governor's proposal differs from the current state budget that is currently operating and funding the state government in New Hampshire. So in case you didn't catch that first webinar, let's talk a tiny bit about the context for the current state budget proposal. The next state budget that's going to take effect starting July 1st, 2023, will last until June of 2025. And over that time period, there could be quite a few changes in the economy. And right now, the economic picture is a little bit uncertain. If you look back 2 years, if you were to go back to June of 2021 or June of 2020, particularly, the economy was in a very different situation. So hopefully there won't be that much dramatic change, but this next 2-year state budget is covering a lot of time as a biennial budget, and that can cover, again, an uncertain economic environment. There are economic forecasters who are predicting a recession, but the likelihood of that recession, the timing of that recession is unknown. But if we were to have a recession, there would be potentially big impacts on our revenues and that fund the state budget, and also big impacts on the service needs, the needs that granite staters have that they're looking to the state government to help support. The current state revenue surplus that we have is driven in large part, not entirely, but in large part by a rise in national corporate profits. Large multi-state, multinational corporations have been very profitable over this time period. That has, especially since the initial start of the pandemic, did drop corporate profits, but after that there's been an increase and a very substantial one. That has boosted our business profits tax revenue. That is the largest tax revenue source the state government has. And in times of economic uncertainty, that may be more volatile than other tax revenue sources and other revenue sources that are non-tax sources as well. And if there are rises in unemployment or income losses as people lose maybe one of the 2 or 3 jobs that they're part-time jobs that they have, or if there's continuing inflation, if inflation does not abate and continues at a high pace, that may lead to higher service needs as well, including needs like Medicaid enrollment. If more people are enrolled in Medicaid relative to what would have been had there not been an economic downturn, then we see higher costs at the state level. Now, there are workforce constraints that are likely holding back our economic growth now. If you look in relatively recently released data, if you look at the workforce in early 2023 and look at the average over calendar year 2022, the workforce in New Hampshire, the number of people employed and working or looking for work actively, that's smaller than it was in 2019. There are some pandemic-related effects to that, but there are also long-term demographics that are driving that, and other factors that are constraining the growth of the workforce. But even with relatively high employment and a low unemployment rate, about 1 in 3 New Hampshire adults reported it was somewhat or very difficult to afford usual household expenses in the first half of March. So that shows that a lot of households are still struggling to meet their usual financial obligations. And both inflation and income relative to inflation, relative to other costs, this accelerated inflation aside, those costs are consuming more of household budgets. So let's talk, speaking of budgets, let's talk about the state budget that's being formed and its current status in the biennial budget process. A little bit of this is review, but just to remind you, when we're talking about the state budget, we're talking actually about 2 pieces of legislation: the operating budget bill, typically House Bill 1, and the trailer bill, which is typically House Bill 2, and is in this case. In House Bill 1, those are all the line items that go through every agency, or almost every agency, and House Bill 2 can include appropriations. Most of the appropriations are in House Bill 1, but House Bill 2 also includes other policy text and other policy frameworks, and the House Finance Committee has added several separate bills into House Bill 2 at this point as well. Now, where we are in the process timeline, the state budget is built in 5 phases. That started all the way back with the state agencies planning their budget requests last summer. The governor released the operating budget bill on February 14th, ahead of his February 15th deadline. And then the House phase is about to end later this week with a vote in the full House of Representatives on April 6th, where the full House will consider House Bill 1 and House Bill 2, including the amendments to those proposed by the House Finance Committee, which is what we'll be talking about for the rest of this webinar. After that, it will move on to the Senate and then the Committee of Conference. So right now, we are between the House Finance Committee finishing its work and the full transmission of that work in the form of amendments to the House for consideration on April 6th. The governor did propose his House Bill 1 proposal on February 14th. That was published. House Bill 2, the trailer bill, was published in its full form on March 1st. But that the House Finance Committee had seen some early indications and some initial documents that were laying out parts of House Bill 2 before then. The House Finance Committee had a relatively short period of time to work. They completed their work on March 29th, even after only getting the full House Bill 2 version on March 1st. Both House Bill 1 and House Bill 2 were altered by the House Finance Committee in their proposed amendments, and they're making a formal presentation on their budget proposal at 1 p.m. today. The House will consider those amendments that are proposed by the House Finance Committee to House Bills 1 and 2. There are also floor amendments, or an opportunity for floor amendments to be made on April 6th as well. After the House does its work, the budget process will move to the Senate Finance Committee. The Senate will make any amendments by June 8th, that is its deadline, and then the amendments made by the Senate will return to the House for consideration. And if the House disagrees with any of those changes, that will trigger a committee of conference. And while this week's vote on the floor of the House of Representatives may include floor amendments, the vote on committee of conference package does not. That is an up or down vote. Okay, so what are some of the changes in terms of the top line numbers, the sort of headline totals that the House Finance Committee made to the governor's proposal? Well, if we put the House Finance Committee budget in context, we can see that it is a growing budget relative to the past state budgets that funded each state fiscal year within their 2-year packages. And this graph is not adjusted for inflation. We don't exactly know what future inflation will be, but you can see that there's a pretty substantial growth between the current state budget for fiscal years 22 and 23 as enacted and the fiscal year 24 and 25 budget proposed by the House Finance Committee. The House Finance Committee's total, and there are a couple different ways you can measure this, but the House Finance Committee's total is about $15.76 billion, including both House Bill 1 and the trailer bill appropriations in House Bill 2. That amounts to a roughly $2.5 billion increase over the current two-year state budget. That's about 18.8%. And that's been impacted by inflation, so the cost of providing the same services are higher, and policy changes have also made that total different. Again, depending on exactly how you measure it, it's about $180 million or 1.3% of an increase over the governor's budget proposal. Again, that includes the trailer bill appropriations. The House Finance Committee was working with lower revenue estimates. The revenue estimates for the general and education trust funds were about $131 million lower than the revenue estimates that the governor used. The increase is funded by changes in tax policy proposals, which decreases revenue lost in tax reductions during the next biennium relative to the governor. But revenue losses would be increased in the next budget biennium for state fiscal years 26 and 27 under the House Finance Committee's proposal relative to the governor's proposal. The House Finance Committee would also contribute fewer funds to the state's rainy day fund relative to the governor's proposal as well. And we'll talk about some of those aspects in a little more detail. But what does the broad picture look like? What does the House Finance Committee fund? Well, there are 6 categories of state government operations, and 2 of them, health and social services and education, make up about 2/3 of the House Finance Committee's proposal. This is the entire proposal. This is not just the difference from the governor. And it reflects pretty similarly what we've seen over the last several state budget cycles, at least, that the health and social services portion of the state budget, which is not only, but mostly the Department of Health and Human Services budget, that is the plurality, that is about 43% of the state budget's appropriations. The education portion, which includes funding for local public schools that go through the Department of Education, that's a little under 1/4 of the state budget proposal. And the remaining third is all the other state agencies. Justice and Public Protection includes several state agencies. Department of Transportation is just the Department of Transportation. And then General Government and Resource Protection and Development include collections of state agencies as well. So how does this compare to what the governor had proposed, and how does it compare to the current state budget? So here are the changes by category relative to the current state budget as it was originally enacted in June of 2021. And here you can see both the governor and the House Finance Committee's largest increases are in health and social services and the general government category. Some of that increase in general government is because of funds that were off budget in the last state budget that have been proposed to be brought back onto the budget. So same amount of actual government expenditure, but the funds are recognized in the state budget in the current proposals, as opposed to the state budget that passed in June of 2021, which shifted them entirely off budget. The increases that we see in health and social services and in general government are higher for the House Finance Committee than they are for the governor, as well as for education. The others are relatively stable, although there's a decline in justice and public protection and a smaller decline in resource protection and development that we see in the House Finance Committee. Transportation gets a little bit of a boost. But when state policymakers are thinking about the state budget, they're often thinking about it in terms of funds, which funds are how the state budget is organized. They act sort of as accounts. Money flows in from various sources and goes out for various purposes. And here we can see that the largest fund in terms of the source of operating support are federal funds. And this is true for the current state budget and has been true for prior state budget biennia as well. The federal funds make up about 1/3 of the operating funding that flows into the New Hampshire state budget. Here we can see in the House Finance Committee's proposal, the general fund is almost 30%. These are the most flexible funds in terms of what state policymakers have available to direct across different priorities. The Education Trust Fund is about 15%, and you can see the smaller funds, the Highway Fund, the Turnpike Fund, Liquor Fund, Fish and Game Fund, and Sweepstakes make up those smaller slices. Other funds is, I've heard more than 200, I've also heard more than 300, but all these smaller other funds that typically have specific dedicated uses in statute, those make up about 15%. Now, how did those change? in the House Finance Committee's proposal relative to the governor's budget proposal and relative to the current state budget. So the $0 line here is, again, the current state budget. And you can see, again, as you saw in the last chart, green is the governor's change from the current state budget, and orange is the House Finance Committee's proposal. And here we can see federal funds do grow a little bit in the House Finance Committee's proposal. Some of that is a little bit related to accounting, so I'll address that a little bit later. The Education Trust Fund, you can see a pretty substantial decrease, and the General Fund, a substantial increase. The General Fund increase in the House Finance Committee's proposal is quite significant. Some of that is because of policy change, but some of that is because of how funds are directed in terms of the flow of funds between the Education Trust Fund and the General Fund. The House Finance Committee would direct more funds that under the governor's proposal would go to the Education Trust Fund. The House Finance Committee would direct more of those to the General Fund, and we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. And you can see the rest of the funds are relatively similar, both to the current state budget, although there's a boost in the highway fund and a drop in the turnpike fund that's more substantial, and to each other. The governor's and the House Finance Committee's changes are relatively close to each other in most cases. So let's go into a little bit more detail and look at the state agency level. Now, the governor's budget outlines the state agencies are organized in a way that allows you to identify 40 state agencies in the budget proposals. And of these 40 agencies, 25 were changed in their funding levels by the House Finance Committee. So not every state agency was changed in terms of its funding level. Again, 15 of them weren't, but 25 of them did see funding changes. What you see in this graph are funding changes that are greater than $1 million. So there are several other state agencies that had changes of less than $1 million over the biennium, and those aren't included here. You can see the largest increase is at the Department of Health and Human Services, and then another large increase of $100 million at the New Hampshire retirement system. And then there are smaller increases at the Department of Education and Transportation and Revenue Administration and Information Technology, as well as the contribution to the community college system of New Hampshire. If you look all the way over on the right side of your screen, you'll see that the Treasury Department, the Department of Administrative Services, the New Hampshire Housing Finance Authority, the Department of Business and Economic Affairs, and the Department of Corrections all see more substantial drops in terms of the funding proposed by the House Finance Committee relative to the governor. And again, this graph is just relative to what the governor proposed. So what are some of those changes? Well, let's set aside Health and Human Services and Education for a moment. We'll talk about those in more detail, as well as transportation. But if you look at some of those other changes, the retirement system saw that $100 million increase. $50 million of that is a one-time payment to the unfunded accrued actuarial liability in the New Hampshire retirement system. That total in June of 2021 was, according to the State Treasury Department, was about $5.7 billion. So that $50 million contribution, I've seen some analysis that over the next 2 decades, that would lead to about $105 million in savings, I believe was the figure. So that $105 million in savings is a portion of that $5.7 billion, but the $5.7 billion unfunded accrued actuarial liability is obviously more substantial. So this is a contribution to that from the state's operating fund surplus. There's also a $25 million per year contribution through State Fiscal Year 2032, and that's $50 million in total through the next budget biennium. That would refund retirement contributions for certain state and local police and fire employees. So these are Group 2, so to speak, retirement in the New Hampshire retirement system. These were individuals who were not vested prior to 2012, but would have been prior to 2013. And as a result, because they did not receive the same level of benefits. This is about 1,860 individuals, I believe it is. And again, that's an approximate number that would essentially receive benefits as if they had been vested in the appropriate time period to not be impacted by the reforms to the New Hampshire retirement system at that time. There's also an annual cap on retiree pay that was boosted to $125,000 in these cases. And the change actually defines vested in the retirement system in statute, which is not currently defined in statute. On the other end, in terms of decreases at the Department of Administrative Services, there's a $15 million appropriation for a legislative parking garage that was deleted out of the state budget. But in their budget math, the House Finance Committee did account for a $25 million appropriation in a separate House bill. So that appropriation exists, it's just not in the state budget and that in the House Finance Committee's planning. There's also $10 million that was moved away from the Affordable Housing Fund. That's the reduction at the New Hampshire Housing Finance Authority, and $15 million that was shifted away from the Department of Business and Economic Affairs. That was also housing-related dollars that would go to the Invest NH Fund that would be set up in statute, is currently just authorized through the Joint Legislative Fiscal Committee and the Executive Council, and funded with flexible funds from the American Rescue Plan Act. The governor's budget proposal would put it in statute and add a $30 million appropriation. The House reduced that, the House Finance Committee, reduced that to $15 million and directed the funds only at aid to municipalities related to housing. So couldn't go directly to developers, for example. And there's also a $40 million reduction at the Department of Corrections. The governor had proposed $10 million from State Fiscal Year 2023 surplus and $40 million in State Fiscal Year 2024 to jumpstart what he identified would likely be a $350 to $450 million project of building a new state prison for men. The Department of Corrections budget was reduced by the House Finance Committee by that $40 million in State Fiscal Year 2024. They left in $10 million, but for really just preliminary work, identifying a site for the new prison and some of those changes prior to the full $40 million appropriation. So I promised you that we would talk more about the Department of Health and Human Services budget. So let's look at that Health and Social Services category and see what those changes were. In the Health and Human Services category, there's the Veterans Home, the State Veterans Home, which the House Finance Committee did not change the budget of, and the Department of Health and Human Services, which is most of that Health and Social Services category. So what you're seeing on this graph are changes within agencies identified in the budget within the Department of Health and Human Services. So these are sub-agencies, be they divisions or offices within the Department of Health and Human Services. And you can see that most of the change, this is the change the House Finance Committee made relative to the governor's proposal. The difference in dollars is in blue, and the percentage difference relative to the funding levels in the governor's proposal is in green. And you can see that there was a small decrease in the public health division, and there were smaller changes in most of the divisions. However, there was an increase at Hampstead Hospital, at the Human Services Division, at the Behavioral Health Division, and in the Office of Medicaid Services. So let's break those down a little bit. But one thing I do want to note is that the Office of Medicaid Services increase, that is prior to the changes in Medicaid reimbursement rates that are in the trailer bill. So some of those changes that are in the trailer bill are not reflected here. This is just looking at the budget lines themselves. So the large dollar differences in House Bill 1 that we were just looking at are due, in the Medicaid ones in particular, are due to shifting Medicaid information technology funding. This is the MMIS software. And from the trailer bill appropriation, the governor had made a trailer bill appropriation of about $20 million that was shifted into the House Bill 1 budget lines by the House Finance Committee. And then the federal matching funds were reflected in the House Finance Committee budget as well as a result. So the actual appropriations in terms of state funds were the same, but federal funds were then recognized in House Bill 1 and they weren't in House Bill 2. And the House Bill 2 appropriation. So same activities, but an increase in the budget lines because of those anticipated federal funds coming in. And that is better than a 50-50 match. There's more than a dollar for dollar match coming in from the federal government there. And Sununu Youth Services Center's operations that were funded in the trailer bill in House Bill 2 were moved into the House Bill 1 budget lines. And that's part of the increase that you see in the Human Services division there. The behavioral health increases include $28.1 million to support children's residential rates and boost provider capacity on that front, and also $2.1 million for the governor's commission on alcohol and other drugs. There was a back of the budget funding reduction across the Department of Health and Human Services budget lines that's not reflected in those individual agencies because that back of the budget reduction is an expectation of reduced funding across all budget lines in DHHS. That totals $23.4 million across the biennium in general funds. The public health division changes are due to reducing federal funds associated with a family planning grant, and that's to align with the federal grant dollars coming in. And one thing I do want to note when we're talking about especially just the House Bill 1 changes or the changes by state agency as opposed to the overall fund changes, the state employee pay increase that the governor had proposed and the House Finance Committee retained, so that's not a difference between the two, but those pay increases are not reflected in the House Bill 1 lines because they're made in appropriations in the trailer bill. As a result, we don't have the breakdown of how they would reflect state agencies or reflect sub-agencies within the Department of Health and Human Services, for example, as we're discussing here. So that's something to remember when you're looking at these state agency budget lines that don't have very much change. The 10% pay increase in the first year and the 2% in the second year to pay state employees, that change isn't reflected in the House Bill 1 budget lines because all those appropriations are in House Bill 2. This is why I reminded you at the beginning with that slide showing the two bills together, and that the state budget is made up of these two bills. One change that was very significant that the House Finance Committee made, or several changes, I should say, were relative to Medicaid. The House Finance Committee did take the option that's relatively newly available from the federal government to expand Medicaid coverage for 12 months postpartum, so after a birth. Currently, I believe it's 60 days, so this 12-month expansion is considerably more coverage for mothers and young families. The House also proposed extending the Granted Advantage program. This is Medicaid expansion for adults with low incomes under the Affordable Care Act. The proposal would extend coverage for 2 more years through the end of 2025. It's currently set to expire at the end of 2023. And change the funding structure to rely on Liquor Commission profits and not the Alcohol Abuse Prevention and Treatment Fund, which I've summarized as the alcohol fund here. So that funding structure change and that 2-year extension is in the state budget. The Senate has passed a bill that would extend Medicaid expansion in perpetuity, so not have a 2-year extension. In the past, Medicaid expansion has been extended for 2 years in its first authorization in 2014, 2 years in its second authorization, and then the current authorization was a 5-year extension. So that's sort of the history of how it's been extended. This puts a 2-year extension on the table as part of the state budget. There's also $28.6 million in developmental services related funding that would be rolled forward from expected lapse in those budget lines. That lapse is largely due to workforce constraints. This $28.6 million is being rolled forward would not reduce the appropriations in those budget lines, nor would it increase them. It would just change the funding source and reflect an expectation that there would be lapses in some of those services. Also, counties are required to provide a portion of the non-federal share of Medicaid funding for nursing homes, both at the county nursing home level and in private nursing homes where one of their residents are being cared for, and in home and community-based services through the Choices for Independence Medicaid waiver program. Counties are responsible for a significant portion, most of the non-federal share. The county contribution typically increases every year. The House Finance Committee's proposal would hold the county contribution constant at State Fiscal Years 2023 levels. So again, not a change in services, just a change in the funding sources, and makes it so that counties are relied upon less to fund that, which probably puts less upward pressure on county property taxes. There's also, and this is another really significant piece, one of the more significant pieces in terms of Medicaid, as an increase in Medicaid reimbursement rates for providers. And this is a change from the governor's proposal. The total amount here is $94.2 million that's included in appropriations via the trailer bill, so that don't show up in those budget lines in House Bill 1. And that doesn't include the matching funds from the federal government. So the total amount that would go out the door would be at least double, because there'd be a 50-50 federal match for most of these services, and in some cases a better match. That amount is $24 million for all providers. So there's it's not specified as an across-the-board rate increase in the legislation, but it is designed to be able to be provided to all providers. And it does carve out hospitals, however, and as a result, it is, in part because of that, it's as a result lower than the governor's appropriation. The governor had proposed $34 million in what he described as an across-the-board 3.1% rate increase. This is a $24 million increase because it doesn't include the hospitals, who my understanding is the New Hampshire Hospital Association has said those rate increases should go to other providers who need to have places where people who are discharged from hospitals can go to the appropriate level of care. And there's also $70.2 million in targeted rate increases that are set aside for specific purposes in House Bill 2. Those targeted rate increases, and I've combined some of the categories here, they're actually more targeted and broken out in more detail than this, but those targeted rate increases amount to that $70.2 million, again, in general funds, so not including the federal match. Community mental health services, and again, this is a combined category across various types of community mental health services, but they would see the largest increase over the biennium of $18.7 million out of that 70.2. Developmental services, acquired brain disorders, in-home supports and early supports and services would see $14 million. And then there's smaller increases for home health, personal care, and food assistance providers, $10 million. That food assistance providers includes Meals on Wheels, for example. And then nursing homes and assisted living facilities would receive a combined $9.2 million split between them and their different services. Ambulance and EMT services and substance use related services, substance use disorder related services do have an increase. Private duty nursing providers and then midwives and birthing centers, again, the latter one being two separate appropriations, see increases. And these increases are set. These increases in Medicaid reimbursement rates would be set to begin in January of 2024. The last bar that you see all the way over on the right is $10 million provided to the department to accelerate some of these increases to start earlier. So that accelerated increase could be funded by that $10 million appropriation. So starting before January of 2024, and that's the option that the department has to deploy those. Under the House Finance Committee's proposal, I should say. There were some other key changes related to DHHS relative to the governor's proposal. The University of New Hampshire Kersey School of Public Policy has been putting out a fair bit of research recently that does show the importance of child care assistance eligibility thresholds, especially if you compare New Hampshire and Vermont. In New Hampshire, the House Finance Committee's proposal would increase the assistance eligibility threshold to 85% of median income, and that's a potentially significant increase in access to child care assistance for families in New Hampshire. There's also an increase in the child care provider reimbursement rates. They would be set to the 75th percentile of the market rate for child care, or be set under a true cost of care mechanism, and it is in quotes because that is how it is identified in the proposed statute. That true cost of care mechanism would then be used to set those provider reimbursement rates. In both cases, temporary assistance for needy family funds, which are block grant dollars from the federal government, they could be used for those new reimbursements and to enhance eligibility, and also or for that expanded eligibility, and also to avoid wait lists for child care services. There are funds in the state budget as proposed by the governor that would be used for the construction of the Sununu Youth Services Center's successor building. Not one that's as large as the Sununu Youth Services Center, a much smaller facility or a much smaller building, really. The governor had proposed $10 million be set aside for that, and then $15 million be drawn from Flexible American Rescue Plan Act dollars. The House Finance Committee said that all the funds have to be from those Flexible American Rescue Plan Act dollars, and as I noted before, there are about, there are about 50 million of those dollars left at this point. Hospitals would no longer be required to have specific beds, or what are called designated receiving facility beds, to have licenses. The governor had proposed that, and the House Finance Committee took out that requirement. And the governor had proposed additional funding for family resource centers for juvenile peer-to-peer grief support, particularly around losses related to substance use disorders, and for recovery-friendly workplaces. The House Finance Committee proposed removing all of those appropriations from the governor's proposal. A couple more changes related to DHHS. There's $4.4 million in additional funds in State Fiscal Year 2025 for Hampstead Hospital. You saw that on the graph. That would fund operations at the hospital that was required by the state through federal funds that serves primarily children with severe emotional disturbances. There's also a new Data Privacy and Information Technology Security Governance Board established within the DHHS under the House Committee proposal. There's also, the House Finance Committee also would suspend some aspects of the state's participation in the state healthcare facility workplace violence prevention program for the biennium, and changing some of the requirements around how the rules for that program are created. There's also a kidney cancer study for the town of Merrimack that was funded with, I believe, a $500,000 appropriation. There's a $400,000 appropriation for specific youth substance use prevention programs, and those programs are listed specifically in the appropriation. There's also nearly $201,000 to the Office of Child Advocate for a new case management system that was added. And the governor had proposed an audit of the integrated eligibility system, and that was removed by the House Finance Committee. But the House Finance Committee did add a prescription drug affordability board reporting and competitive bid requirements and a dedicated fund for that board. Now pardon me, you got a sneak peek. Let's move on to education. That's the health and social services category. Let's move on to education and start with the House Finance Committee's proposed changes to the education funding formula. This is the way the state dispenses the adequate education aid that goes to fund a portion of local government expenditures for local public education. This table shows the breakdown of how that formula works under current law, as if it were carried forward to fiscal year 2024, what would that look like under the governor's proposal and under the House Finance Committee proposal all the way over on the right. And on the left, you can see the different types of aid categories through the funding proposal. Base per pupil aid under current law would be a little less than $3,900 per student. So a student in a school district who's there for the full year would receive, the school district would receive $3,900 from the state, regardless of any other characteristics that the student may have or that the community may have. The governor's proposal would boost that to $4,700. The House Finance Committee kept that number. Free and reduced price meal eligibility. So these are students who are eligible for free or reduced price meals at school. And to be eligible for that, you typically have to have incomes below 185% of the federal poverty guidelines. That amount in current law is a little over $1,900 per student. The governor proposed boosting that to $2,500. The House Finance Committee kept that same amount. For special education aid, these are typically triggered by whether a student has an individualized education plan or not. The governor proposed keeping that the same as current law. The House Finance Committee bumped that up a little bit. Same with English language learner aid. The House Finance Committee proposed bumping that up, again, a relatively small amount. Third grade reading proficiency, that is if a student scores, if the student isn't eligible for free and reduced price meals, for special education aid, or is not an English language learner as defined, the third grade, if their third grade reading score was below proficient, the school district receives additional aid under the current funding formula. The governor's proposal and the House Finance Committee's proposal would both eliminate that. The governor and the House Finance Committee would both eliminate relief aid, which is based on the concentration of students, the percentage of students who are eligible for free and reduced price school meals in a community. And both the governor and the House Finance Committee would modify the extraordinary needs grant, which is based on a combination of free and reduced price school meal eligible students and the taxable property value within their community. The governor had proposed increasing this amount over time, over each budget cycle, from a maximum of $650, increasing it by 50% each budget cycle all the way through from state fiscal year 2026. So it wouldn't increase for this budget cycle, but would increase 50% each biennium to 2034. That was changed by the House Finance Committee. The House Finance Committee moved the dollars so that they'd arrive sooner to school districts. And those dollars would then start with a maximum grant that was boosted from that $650 to $3,750 per student would be the maximum amount. And again, it depends on exactly the interaction between the number of students and particularly the property values available per student that were taxable property values. The governor had not indexed those property values to inflation in his proposal. That was indexed to inflation by the House Finance Committee. So those property values in that sliding scale would keep up with inflation, so to speak. That $3,750 would increase each budget biennium as proposed by the House Finance Committee, but it would increase only by 5% as opposed to 50% through state fiscal year 2034. That would be the last increase. Now that 5% increase over that time period means that the very last increase, the one in fiscal 2034, that in the very last increase, the House Finance Committee's amount would be smaller than the governor's proposed amount by about $150 per grant. But over that time, the municipalities that would be receiving additional aid through extraordinary needs grants would receive more under the House Finance Committee's proposal than they would in the governor's proposal. It's not until that last year that the governor's proposal max grant is higher than it is in the House Finance Committee. Both the governor and the House Finance Committee would eliminate stabilization grants, which are based on an old change in the formula, and both would have hold harmless grants, which ensures that the no community in the first budget biennium in the next one that's coming would lose funding with these formula changes. However, those the hold harmless grants would be phased out over time between fiscal year 2026 and fiscal year 2034. So communities would lose funding potentially over that time period, depending on how the community characteristics and the number of students they have interacts with all these other formula changes. And one thing I do want to note, under current law in state fiscal year 2024, the estimated amount of funding that would go out in the adequate education aid formula would be $962 million. Under the governor's proposal, it would be over $1 billion to $1,017 million, and the House Finance Committee proposal would boost that further to $1,035 million. So there are other changes to education funding outside the formula that have a substantial impact. One is expanded eligibility for the education freedom accounts that's currently set at 300% of the federal poverty guidelines for the one-time income test. So it's only when you apply that income test happens. After that, the income doesn't matter for someone to receive education freedom accounts. That would be boosted to 350% of the federal poverty guidelines. And the governor had proposed that selected populations, including children that are identified as persistently bullied, or children who are migrant children or foster care children, they would have an income cap of 500%. The House Finance Committee proposed eliminating that income cap entirely. There is a geographic boundary component to this as well. Schools that are not performing well if a school is not performing well, that can trigger students within the geographic boundary of that school to be eligible for education freedom accounts. And there is some question as to what that geographic boundary component actually means and how it interacts with, particularly with charter schools as well. The governor had proposed a $75 million appropriation for school building aid that was scheduled to come into effect in the end of fiscal year 2025 and go to a new school building aid fund within the Education Trust Fund. That would be eliminated by the House Finance Committee. The House Finance Committee would also permit public charter schools to access building aid and boost the additional per pupil aid that public charter schools get above the education funding formula to $4,300 per pupil. There would also be $4.4 million for tuition and transportation aid to public schools. And the governor had proposed a New Hampshire Civics Commission that would produce a New Hampshire civics textbook based on the New Hampshire Constitution, and the government had created. That textbook would be available to all school districts, all civics classrooms in school districts. The House Finance Committee kept the language, but removed the $2 million appropriation to support that effort. Also, this is a really significant change, especially for school funding. Medicaid direct certification. Right now, there is a direct certification process for students who are enrolled in food stamps or the Supplementary Nutrition Assistance Program. Those students are automatically eligible for free meals at school. And as a result, that does increase the number of students whose school districts receive free and reduced price school meal aid through the education funding formula. This provision would add Medicaid, as a student enrolled in Medicaid would be automatically automatically eligible for a free meal at school as well. And this is a substantial impact potentially because there are more young people in the state enrolled in Medicaid than there are in SNAP, in food stamps. So this would be an expansion of eligibility to reaching people that are likely eligible for free and reduced price school meals, or are eligible based on the income threshold, but have not filled out that particular set of paperwork, but are enrolled in Medicaid. And the House Finance Committee set aside $30 million during the biennium to adjust for the potential of additional free and reduced price meal eligible students. Now, one change, and I alluded to this already, this is the change that shifts money from the Education Trust Fund to the general fund. Basically, this is a change in how that the House Finance Committee proposed, and how the business profits tax and business enterprise tax revenue is divided between the general fund and the Education Trust Fund. Currently, about 20% of the much larger business profits tax in terms of the revenue that it collects, and 91%, almost 91% of the business enterprise tax support the education trust fund, and the remainder of each of the revenue that's brought in by each goes to the general fund. The governor proposed changing this so that 35% of each tax goes to the education trust fund, and the House Finance Committee would reduce that to 22.5%, and also shift certain appropriations that are made out of the education trust fund back to the general fund. They've gone to the education trust fund over time. This would shift them to school building aid, to transportation aid, certain special education aid, and others back to the general fund, where they were several budget cycles ago, but they've been shifted to the education trust fund over time as the education trust fund has built a surplus, because unlike the general fund, which lapses to itself or to the rainy day fund at the end of a budget biennium, the education trust fund keeps the surplus that it has and carries it forward. So the committee proposal, because it directs fewer funds to the education trust fund and more to the general fund, would actually turn a $183.8 million surplus in the education trust fund that's projected for the end of this fiscal year to a $42.6 million deficit in 2025. So that means that the education trust fund would have to be backstopped by the general fund. Now, I do want to emphasize that the education trust fund is backstopped by the general fund. So any obligations that the education trust fund has are backfilled by the general fund. So if the education trust fund runs a deficit, there's a planned $42.6 million transfer, for example, from the general fund to the education trust fund in that year under the House Finance Committee's proposal. So this doesn't actually change any services or funds distributed by the state, but does change the flow of funds and how those funds may be treated in future budget biennia. Now, let's talk about higher education within that education section of the state budget. Both the governor and the House Finance Committee proposed boosts to funding through the state budget for the community college system and the university system. The House Finance Committee actually added more targeted aid for the community college system for specific processes, and the university system it actually made some of the aid less targeted, although didn't add any aid to the governor's proposal. Notably, as you can see here, in unadjusted for inflation dollars, in the university system funding, which is in those blue bars, would actually get back to the point at which operating funds from the state budget would support the university system. It would get back to that pre-aftermath of the Great Recession point that it has been climbing towards over the years, but hasn't gotten back to that point. So the House Finance Committee's proposal would get those dollars back to that level. But some of those targeted funds to the community college system go to a math learning community program for high school students, enhanced access and affordability for post-secondary education, some initiatives there, expansions to the workforce credentials program, and to the dual and concurrent enrollment program. The governor had proposed those changes as well, and the House Finance Committee added funding to those changes, to the dual and concurrent enrollment program, that is. There was also, the governor had proposed shifting future community college system employees out of the New Hampshire retirement system, and the House actually retained that shift. That is not a difference between the two budget proposals. And the governor had proposed $8 million go to renovating a hockey arena at the University of New Hampshire. The House Finance Committee actually removed that or lowered that to $6 million and took $2 million and directed to general support for the university system in State Fiscal Year 2025. The House Finance Committee also removed the governor's proposed student debt relief program that the governor had proposed in the last budget cycle and the budget cycle before. The House Finance Committee proposed removing it in this amendment, and shifted funding for the renovation of the Sugar River Valley Regional Technical Center in Newport from the Education Trust Fund, as the governor had proposed, to the general fund. Okay, a couple quick words on transportation policy changes. One thing that we've seen in past budget cycles too, is that the general fund revenues have grown while the highway fund revenues have not necessarily grown to keep up with planned expenses. The highway fund does rely on motor fuels tax revenue, which is a set dollar amount, about 22 cents approximately per gallon of gasoline or diesel fuel, for example. That set dollar amount doesn't increase over time. That is relative to inflation. That is a declining revenue source. The general fund is funded by tax revenues, including from business profits, that have grown. As a result, there's often been transfers from the general fund to the highway fund. The House Finance Committee is proposing doing that again this cycle. They're also proposing adding a little less than $5 million for equipment replacements at the Department of Transportation and boosting the state match for an urban and rural transit program that would access more federal funds. It would permit accessing more federal funds to the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. There's also an increase in block grants to cities and towns of about $500,000 statewide for transportation projects or transportation operations, I should say. The governor had proposed suspending a requirement that only a certain amount of highway funds go to the Department of Safety. The House Finance Committee would remove the suspension of that requirement, so the requirement would still be in place. And the governor had proposed a new revolving fund for over length, over width, and over height vehicles. The House Finance Committee added overweight vehicles to that list. Okay, a couple other expenditures and policy changes that I want to discuss here is a really key one is that the governor had proposed about 130 pages worth of House Bill 2, as proposed by the governor, was devoted to licensing reforms, eliminating licenses, eliminating some governing boards, and merging some governing boards with the Office of Professional Licensure and Certification and some of the functions of those boards. Most of that has been removed. In place of that 130 pages of House Bill 2, the House Finance Committee proposed a 24-page amendment that would limit the overhaul to the boards for assessors, appraisers, auctioneers, allied health professionals, which is a sort of larger umbrella board, the Boxing Wrestling Commission, electricians, genetic counselors, and pharmacy. Those have been shifted, at least functions of those boards have been shifted under this proposal to the Office of Professional Licensure and Certification. And 3 sets of licenses for athlete agents, itinerant vendors, and hawkers and peddlers. Those would be repealed in the House Finance Committee's proposal, and the regulation of bondsmen would be moved from the State Department, from the Secretary of State's office, that is, to OPLC, Office of Professional Licensure and Certification. Pardon me. One other piece that doesn't impact education funding, at least to my knowledge, but is a significant anti-hunger provision, or potentially significant, is the expansion of eligibility for free school meals to 300% of the federal poverty guidelines, as opposed to that 185%. Again, it's not expected to change the education funding formula definition for this, but it does mean that more students would be eligible for having a free meal at their school. There are also recruitment and retention programs at the Department of Corrections and at the National Guard that are modified under this proposal. A $1 million appropriation to New Hampshire Public Television would be eliminated relative to the governor's proposal. And the governor's trailer bill, which, as I noted to you before, was published on March 1st this year and was published in its full form, I believe, March 2nd in the 2021 budget cycle. That would also be required to be posted publicly by February 15th, which is the same deadline that is in place for House Bill 1. So there's already language in statute that requires transmission by the governor of the trailer bill by February 15th. This would also require it to be publicly posted. And there are a couple other provisions related to housing and related to environmental policy changes, and a couple other changes that I wanted to mention. One is the bulk waste disposal that's a significant amount of food waste would actually be prohibited in certain situations and within a certain geographic radius would have to go to food waste facilities, or facilities that would be ones that are food waste, that are specifically designed for accessing food waste. There's also $2 million that's devoted to solid waste management, including that's diverted to that would be targeted towards diverting food waste, pardon me. There's also a reduction in funding relative to the governor's proposal for polychlorinated biphenyl contamination, or PCB contamination. The governor had proposed $6 million for mitigation research of that. It was reduced by $5 million down to $1 million by the House Finance Committee. There's also a cyanobacteria program that was a separate House bill that the House Finance Committee added in but did not fund in the state budget. There's also a limit on the Winnipesaukee River Basin Control's borrowing authority relative to the state. The governor had proposed removing that limit. The House Finance Committee would raise it from $3 million to $30 million and add in $2.6 million for operations. A PFAS-related fund could be used for grants under the House Finance Committee's proposal as opposed to just loans, and there would be purposes that would be broadened as well. And there's also the Invest NH program that I mentioned before related to housing that could be added, that would be targeted to municipalities in the statute proposed by the House Finance Committee, as opposed to also going to construction, to entities that are doing the construction, to individual developers. There's also the addition of a land review docket, and the permission of adding a presiding justice for the Superior Court for this land review docket in the legislative branch. And the governor had proposed the Historic Housing Preservation Tax Credit and the State Historic Sites Fund. Those were deleted by the House Finance Committee in the House Finance Committee's amendments. And historic sites would be funded separately. The a Bureau of Historic Sites, I believe it's called, would be funded separately in House Bill 1. And the governor also had proposed the Office of Regulatory Review, Reduction, and Government Efficiency at the Department of Business and Economic Affairs. That would basically be a voice for an institutionalized voice for business in those regulatory review processes. That would be eliminated under the House Finance Committee's proposal. They didn't retain that proposal from the governor. And there's a little under $5 million for state building maintenance and also temporary space as entities are moving. Now, there are some policy changes related to revenue and also sets of revenue projections that are important for understanding this proposal. The state is running a surplus, and that substantial surplus has been building over the course of the budget biennium, on a cash basis over the course of the budget biennium so far. As of the end of February, I should say, we'll get the March numbers relatively soon. The state has collected almost $700 million more in general and education trust funds revenue than they anticipated when the budget was passed in June of 2021. If you take out the otherwise enacted expenditures from the last legislative session in 2022, that number drops to $343.7 million, roughly, as of the end of February. The rainy day fund also has $160 million in it as of the end of the last fiscal year. And I mentioned those flexible funds from the American Rescue Plan Act. There are about $50 million that remain unbudgeted in those. And some funds that are, some of those uses of those funds might be reappropriated over time. Now, both the governor and the House Finance Committee did not expect that what's been generating that revenue surplus, the significant upswing in state revenues that we've seen, they didn't project that that would continue. Here again, you can see the governor's projections in green and the House's in orange, and the actual in blue, and you see that very significant increase in general and education trust funds totals. Again, the axis doesn't begin at 0 on this graph, but it's still a significant increase. Both the governor and the House projected that those revenues would be relatively flat over time. Part of the reason they projected that those revenues would be flat, and the House projected actually $131 million less, is because of policy changes. The House Finance Committee did propose keeping the communication services tax, but in favor of, as a component of that would also speed the interest and dividends tax repeal. On this graph, you can see these are the policy changes that have happened recently that are affecting state revenues in a way that the Department of Revenue Administration is estimating. And here you can see in green are various changes to business taxes, including tax rate reductions that were enacted in 2021 and 2022. So that's a little bit more than $60 million each year is the DRA's estimated impact of those. The interest and dividends tax phase out, that is in orange, and you can see that increases over time as that tax rate is reduced. The governor had proposed eliminating the communication services tax. You can see those eliminations in blue, and the governor's proposed 2024 and 2025 revenue changes. The House Finance Committee removed those, so the blue bars aren't on those House 24 and 25 changes, but the House Finance Committee would speed the repeal of the interest and dividends tax, and that's that darker orange bar that you see all the way over on the right bar. And that repeal wouldn't affect the revenue this biennium as much, but would have a more dramatic effect on next biennium's revenue. Now, when we're talking about the interest and dividends tax, it's important to remember that a really significant portion of this tax is paid for by people. Mostly it's people, individual and joint filers in the state, who have relatively high amounts of interest and dividend income. So in tax year 2020, which is the most recent year that we have this data breakdown for, About 1,700 filers, 1,723 filers paid 52% of the revenue collected by the interest and dividends tax. And these were filers that had more than $200,000 in taxable interest and dividend income, which means that at that 5% rate, they were paying $10,000 or more in interest and dividend income. So that doesn't include income from capital gains or salaries or wages. This is just interest, dividend, and distribution income that's taxable under the interest and dividends tax. Now, what does that $200,000 translate into? How is that generated? If you're not selling an asset or earning it through work that's associated with salaries and wages, where is it coming from? Well, this table gives you a sense of how much wealth is required to generate that much income on an annual basis. So if you look all the way over on the left, that is the number of dollars that's paid in interest and dividends tax. And this table basically works your way back to how much wealth would that be under certain circumstances. So if you look in one of the rows in about the middle, $10,000 in interest and dividends tax paid at a 5% rate means that you had $200,000 in interest and dividends income. That $200,000 in interest and dividends income, if it's coming from a set of assets that generates a really healthy return of 5% annual return, again, without selling anything, that's about $4 million in wealth that's required to generate $200,000 at a 5% annual return. 5% is a relatively high return. So if it's 3.5%, then we're talking about $5.7, $5.8 million. If you look all the way over on the right at a 1.51% annual return, that's about $13.4 million in assets that would be required. So that shows that there's a significant amount of wealth behind the income that's generating about half of the interest and dividends tax revenue, and still a substantial amount of wealth for the other half as well. So the House Finance Committee made some other changes related to revenue as well. They did propose adding multi-state tax auditors, two that would be expected to generate about $3 million in combined general and education trust fund revenue, and also made some additional IT investments at the Department of Revenue Administration. And as a result, the House Finance Committee would transfer $96.3 million to the Revenue Stabilization Reserve account, which is the formal name for the rainy day fund, from surpluses in 2023 and 2025. So there would still be surplus dollars available. The rainy day fund transfer is smaller. It's about half the size of the governor's $181.4 million. And that reflects both the lower revenue estimates and the higher expenditures at the House Finance Committee relative to the governor, as well as the House Finance Committee's proposed shift of revenue flowing from the Education Trust Fund to the general fund. That makes more general fund revenue available for essentially being put in the rainy day fund that otherwise would have been in the Education Trust Fund and be carried forward there. The House Finance Committee is also estimating that about $20 million less in agency underspending than the governor does, but that doesn't affect, that affects the rainy day fund contribution, but doesn't affect what we've seen in the budget lines here thus far. So what are some things that are important to look for in the next budget biennium? Well, I mentioned the economy at the start. How will the state budget need to support the economy during the next 2 years, particularly if service needs increase and revenues decline, right, which makes it harder to balance a budget if service needs are going up and revenues are going down. And at the same time, a lot of the federal aid associated with the COVID-19 pandemic is expiring or has expired or is being deployed for specific purposes. That means that with a slowing economy, with maybe increasing service needs, there's fewer federal resources available to sort of address that under current law. And in the next state budget, we might consider what policies can help ensure that services are funded, both in the state budget or the state budget being discussed now and in subsequent ones, how the growth of the workforce is supported, and how our economy stays robust and reaches Granite Staters equitably. And related to that state supports are inclusive of Granite Staters with limited resources, again, helping the benefits of a growing economy reach more Granite Staters who might otherwise not be able to engage in the economy as much, including through some of these workforce constraints that we're seeing. Some workforce supports, some things that might help grow the workforce that are currently challenges are the lack of available housing, right? More housing would help support workforce growth and decreased housing costs. would also help more money be available to go into the local economy as people are not paying as high a housing costs. Care for older adults and individuals with disabilities does mean that people doing those key things are not then engaging in the workforce. Childcare and the lack of availability and the lack of affordability of childcare is a key workforce constraint. There's some survey data that suggests that. And funding for local public and higher education is an important part of long-term workforce growth as well, because the students in schools and the students at our public higher university and college system educational institutions are going to be a key part of the workforce in the state. So when we're thinking about these policies, particularly if there's a weak economy, what might we learn from economic modeling and economic research about what policies help going forward? Well, if you look at modeling from Moody's Analytics, also modeling from the Congressional Budget Office, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and other entities, we can see that in terms of your bang for your buck, if you will, per dollar invested, there's a significant boost to the economy, particularly for local economies and for rural economies in some cases, for dollars that go to families with very limited resources, because those families are more likely to spend those resources on their needs in a rapid fashion in the local economy. So the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program benefits, if those are boosted, for example, by $1, that's $1.61 of economic growth per this modeling from Moody's Analytics based on the economy in 2021. Of course, it changes some with economic conditions, but we can see those positive returns on investment are associated with expanded unemployment insurance, the Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program, transportation infrastructure spending, et cetera. If we look at the other end of the scale, you can see that tax reductions on dividend and capital gains taxes, that has less of an economic impact. Same with corporate tax rate reductions and net operating loss tax offsets, again, in this modeling from Moody's Analytics. So there's a couple more resources I want to point you to. Again, if you missed our webinar in February, we have an issue brief on the governor's budget proposal and what changes it would make relative to the current state budget. That's what this webinar builds off of. And we also had a webinar in February that unpacked the state budget. As we knew at that time, we didn't have the trailer bill yet that's proposed by the governor. We also have a blog about 10 facts about the New Hampshire state budget and resource pages that are updated with our budget and revenue documents. So with that, I'd be happy to take any questions with the remaining time that we have available.
Perfect. Thank you, Phil. Feel free to take a sip of water. I'm always impressed at how you can keep going. So it's great stamina there. We had a good number of questions about the education trust fund, so I'll sort of start to break those down and sort of ask them to you there and sort of reframe them. But feel free, if you have questions, to put them in using the Q&A feature. So Phil, you talked about this, but there are a few questions before and after you sort of mentioned it. So can you talk about sort of what are the implications for the change of the Representative Weiler amendment, essentially moving revenue from the education trust fund to the general fund, and sort of like what are the implications for the change? And a lot of folks are concerned about what sort of cuts to services might have as a result of that. So could you clarify that for us?
Sure. Yeah. So and what Representative Weiler, who was the person who first proposed this amendment that's in the House Finance Committee's proposal, what Representative Weiler identified is that the Education Trust Fund, when it was originally established, was designed to support the adequate education grants that go to municipalities through the education funding formula, or go to communities. They end up at school districts. He had seen over time, as the Education Trust Fund had built a surplus, that more other funding purposes that were related to education had been added to the Education Trust Fund, as in they would draw from the Education Trust Fund. So as opposed to that trust fund only funding adequate education grants, they also funded school building aid, tuition and transportation aid, and several other initiatives as well, including special education aid outside of the education funding formula too. Those dollars being drawn from the Education Trust Fund, but the Education Trust Fund still running a surplus, meant that there was more money available for those education purposes, while the general fund was being used completely for other purposes. So the part of the stated motivation was to make the Education Trust Fund go back to just being about those adequate education grants, and running a deficit for most of last decade, the second decade of this century. The Education Trust Fund did run a deficit. The general fund, again, automatically backstops it. So if the Education Trust Fund's liabilities exceed its revenues, then it's automatically backstopped by the general fund. But that
to that point, if the liabilities did sort of go through, its services will still be paid for because there's been no change in law, right? So that's sort of just important to note that I think is a key piece. So thank you for that.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about how the expansion of the education freedom accounts will affect the education trust? There are a few questions about education freedom accounts and sort of what impact it has on dollars going to public education.
Right. So the education freedom accounts under this proposal, which I should say the revenue shifts in these proposals means that the Education Trust Fund will probably continue to run deficits substantially. And those items that are moved outside of the Education Trust Fund are funded by the general fund are now competing with all the other general fund priorities, right, for dollars. So that could have implications going forward as legislators are looking sort of dollar for dollar, where do our general fund dollars go? The education freedom accounts are still in the Education Trust Fund under the House Finance Committee's proposal. And the education freedom accounts are budgeted to have about between $29 and $30 million a year in both the governor's and the House Finance Committee's proposals. Those education freedom accounts dollars, that's the budgeted amount, but it is a sort of entitlement program in that if someone applies and is eligible, they would receive an education freedom account appropriation. So that means that draw on the Education Trust Fund is really unknown at this point. And there's interactions with other policy proposals here as well, because the education freedom accounts are based on the education funding formula. So it is because those education freedom accounts are drawn from the Education Trust Fund. That means within the smaller pie under the House Finance Committee's proposal, that is the Education Trust Fund, those education freedom accounts would be drawing from that smaller piece, but would still have that general fund backstop. So that means both adequate education aid and to communities and education freedom accounts could end up drawing a significant amount of general funds if the Education Trust Fund is underfunded relative to its liabilities.
Absolutely. And in terms of the school building aid, the governor, my understanding, a few questions about this and confusing sort of things. The governor, I believe, added $75 million there. That amount was taken out in the House Finance proposal. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. But one important thing to remember is that the governor had proposed boosting school building aid in the regular budget lines for school building aid, and also had appropriated $75 million at the end of the biennium that would go into a special school building aid fund within the Education Trust Fund. The House Finance Committee took out those latter components, the $75 million and the Education Trust Fund sub-fund, if you will, about school building aid. But the House Finance Committee kept the higher appropriations in the budget lines for school building aid, again, relative to what we saw in the current budget biennium.
Perfect, thank you. And question about the slide talking about college and university numbers. Those numbers are not just adjusted for inflation. That's correct?
That's correct.
And
these
can you
numbers
maybe, because I know we get this question often, can you explain just sort of the rationale why we don't do that just generally as an organization?
Yes, absolutely. So you'll see in other NHFPI materials that are just backward looking that we do adjust for inflation. So you can find a earlier version of this same graph that is adjusted for inflation in our building the budget document, for example. So that is something we do when we're just looking backwards. Because we're looking forward here, we're looking into fiscal years 2024 and 2025, which haven't happened yet. We don't adjust for inflation because that would require a set of assumptions about inflation. And that can make both creating and understanding the graph more complex. It's not as helpful as that point, as opposed to just the specific dollar amounts. So if we were just looking backward, we would adjust it for inflation, or at least show you what that inflation adjustment looks like. Looking forward, we aren't in the business of forecasting inflation, so we don't include that in here.
Absolutely. And a few questions about back of the budget reductions. Can you just quickly explain when the legislature says, X agency has $10 million, for example, in back of the budget, who decides where those dollars are taken from? How does that process work? And does the legislature give any information, or is it up to the departments to make those decisions?
Yeah, so it does depend on the structure of the back of the budget reduction. And I should say these are typically in House Bill 1, and they're at the end of House Bill 1, where there is a little bit of text after those budget lines. The back of the budget reductions can be structured to be sort of across the board, across all state government, and then it's up to the executive branch to find those savings. They can be structured so that they are targeted only at certain departments or certain agencies. For example, the current proposal would have $23.4 million in general funds taken out of the Department of Health and Human Services budget lines. Those aren't in specific budget lines, so it is up to the management of the agency to find those savings and to choose where those savings are within their budgets. But they do have to meet them. This is unlike a lapse requirement, which is not set in statute. And a lapse requirement is more of an expectation as opposed to something that is required, which under the House Finance Committee's proposal, this back of the budget reduction would be. Sometimes back of the budget reductions carve out particular service areas. That was the case in 2019. The DHHS had a back of the budget reduction, but particular service areas, including developmental services, were protected from those back of the budget reductions per how it was designed in statute.
Thank you. Can you explain, you had the slide that talks about how the revenue estimates were lower, but people are still a little bit maybe fuzzy on how you can have lower revenue estimates, yet the House budget spends more than the governor's budget. So how does the House go about spending actually more dollars, but using less revenue? Where's the money coming from?
Yes, so that's a great question. Some of it is because the House devotes less to the rainy day fund, right? So the governor had higher revenue estimates, but put more in the rainy day fund. The House devotes less to the rainy day fund. And that's about a $90 million gap right there. So about half the difference already between the governors and the houses. The House does devote more money to the rainy day fund in part than it would have otherwise, because more general fund money gets pushed into the rainy day fund because less money goes to the education trust fund. So that's part of how that accounting impacts where those dollars end up. The House also, by taking some trailer bill appropriations and recognizing the federal revenue that's actually going to come in to the state budget as associated with those trailer bill appropriations, that increases the size of the budget, even though it doesn't actually increase the amount of federal revenue that would have come in anyway under the governor's proposal. So some of it is just accounting. And some of it is because the House Finance Committee does raise more revenue through changes in taxation relative to the governor's proposal than the governor does. So the House Finance Committee keeps the communication services tax. It accelerates the reduction in the interest and dividends tax to eliminate in 2025 as opposed to 2027. And that reduces revenue substantially in the next budget biennium. But in this one being discussed, more tax revenue is raised because of the retention of the communication services tax. So revenue estimates, the baseline revenue estimates are lower, but the House Finance Committee keeping the communication services tax, which is particularly related to some of those retirement system contribution changes, that retention meant that the House Finance Committee had somewhat more dollars to spend relative to what just the revenue estimate difference would show.
Well, we had one question about any additional funding for CTEs, and I believe I saw that. I think we have a slide that talks about one particular.
Yeah, so the relative to the governor's budget proposal, I don't believe that there's more funding that the House Finance Committee added specifically for CTEs. I don't think there is relative to the governor's budget proposal. There were, however, there's a funding switch in terms of the renovations at the Sugar River Valley one. That's no longer education trust fund, that is general fund. So that was one of those changes. The governor's budget proposal, I believe, did have an increase for CTE funding. I think, and I'd have to look back at the issue brief, which I'd encourage you all to do to confirm that. But I don't believe the House added specific funding for CTEs other than that funding switch. I could be wrong on that, but I think that's the case.
Perfect. We had a question. Keep them coming. This is always exciting thing to see what folks' questions they have. It looks like the question was asked. Did I hear you say under this proposal, the governor's requirement that hospitals add inpatient mental health beds has been removed?
Yeah, so the governor had required adding designated, had proposed requiring adding designated receiving facility beds at hospitals as a condition of them having a license. The House Finance Committee removed that provision, so that would no longer be a requirement. Hospitals would not have to have a certain number of designated receiving facility beds based on the size of the hospital as the governor had proposed.
Perfect. And just, someone asked this, and I'll do a quick mention. We often, and it still shows the question, there was a question about why are disabled folks shown as not in the workforce. That, Phil, correct me if I'm wrong, that's the sort of way the survey data reports. And so we're just using our information, using the survey information in the language that they use. That's not terminology or questions that we ask. That's data that the government collects that we just report on. So just sort of wanted to clarify the way that question is.
Yeah, there is, and to the extent that I identified caring for older adults or adults with a physical disability or any form of disability as a workforce constraint, that can be both for those individuals, but also for the people who are caring for those individuals, right? In both cases, you are seeing what could be addressed with potentially more public services or publicly funded services available to either support workforce participation for individuals with disabilities or the people caring for individuals with disabilities. In both cases, there could be publicly funded workforce supports that would help everyone involved engage in the workforce.
Perfect. And I should note, I often use my Concord lingo, so I apologize. CTE, career and technical education centers. When we're thinking about what that is, that's sort of the terminology there. So thank you for that reminder. Just looking through.
I'll take a sip of water while you're.
Thank you. So a few questions about the next phase. I know we'll have a webinar on June 12th, but again, sort of the revenues. Can you talk a little bit about what's going to happen in terms of the next 2 months of revenues and how that might inform what the Senate does? Don't want to speculate on what they might do, but the benefits of sort of, if you will, going last in this process, like what does the Senate benefit from going last in the process?
Yeah, so, and it's a great question. Both March and April are significant months for state revenue. And it could be that we already know what the March revenues are. That could have been posted during this webinar, as far as I know. But both are significant because the revenues associated with end of year tax returns come in March and April. And that's particularly important for the business taxes. The business profits and business enterprise taxes are both paid in quarterly estimates, but those end of year tax returns tend to bring in a substantial amount of revenue as well. And they tell us something about the direction of the economy. If revenues are continuing to grow, that shows that there may be more health in the economy that could lead to more optimistic revenue forecasts. Once the Senate has the data from March and April, they will be doing their final forecasting probably in mid-May in the Senate Ways and Means Committee. So that means that oftentimes the Senate will have more favorable revenue projections in terms of more revenue coming in under current policy. That being said, right now we're in a situation where revenues have grown year on year in the state budget, but in the current budget biennium, but they have not grown in a way that is necessarily outpacing inflation in all cases. So there's questions going forward as to what revenues look like, but the Senate has the benefit of additional information. One thing I do want to note, tax returns, there are quarterly estimates that are also paid in March and April, depending on the entity type. Tax returns are about the prior year's economic activity. The quarterly estimate is about the current year's economic activity. So there's some parsing that has to be done, but yes, we learn more about revenue in March and April. The House doesn't have the benefit of that when they're doing their revenue forecasts. The Senate does.
Absolutely. Are there any funds to a few questions about for the disabled, is there a proposal when it comes to transportation issues? Does this budget cover anything regarding that, to your knowledge?
So there is increased funding for both developmental services and for Choices for Independence Medicaid waiver services. So both of those are in home and community-based settings. To the extent that those funds are used for transportation-related purposes, for example, for people receiving services through the Developmental Disabilities Medicaid waiver or through acquired brain disorders waivers, there's transportation funding is often associated with those. There may be funding for modifications of vans, for example, and for getting out in the community. So there's increases in funding in those budget lines, and those increases, some of them are here in the House Finance Committee's proposal, but a lot of them were in the governor's proposal and unchanged by the House Finance Committee, so they're carried forward. That's where I would look for those increases for folks with disabilities of some form. Within those increases, some of those dollars could be used for transportation. At least in some cases, it depends on their individual budgets or what's authorized for them as an individual. There's not necessarily a budget line that is, here's funding for transportation for people with developmental disabilities. It's just in the developmental disability waiver line, for example, and there has been a substantial increase there.
Perfect. And then there was a question about, and I think that the answer to this is we probably don't know until everything is sort of finalized, but would New Hampshire has historically been 50 out of 50 when it comes to education funding. Would these additional dollars in the House budget, would that sort of change those numbers in any meaningful way?
Yeah, so New Hampshire, if you look at the percentage of state and local funds that are spent on local public education, that comes from the state. So,
sorry, in the higher education sort of. So thinking about our public university system.
Yes. And I'll answer relative to the education funding formula. We'd have to see what changes other states have made to see how we rank. For higher education, I don't expect it to change that appreciably. Certainly, there's a couple key measures that are used to measure that higher education relative to other educational institutions around the country in terms of public funding for them. I don't expect that to change appreciably because New Hampshire is quite a ways behind the next state in a couple of those measures. So it may be that some other states have had reductions that might, get us out of the 50th spot, if you will. So we won't know that until the data are collected from all 50 states. This is an increase in funding, but it's probably not a substantial enough increase to get us, certainly not well into the middle of the pack, for example.
Perfect. And the last question, sort of, when we look at that interest and dividends chart, a few folks had questions about the numbers that we use. Can you just sort of, I think they're referring to that asset. Yes, thank you. Yes. Can you talk a little bit about why sort of these numbers are used in terms of the taxable interest income and sort of where those come from and why sort of we kind of center our research and our work on these particular figures? A lot of folks ask questions about that.
Yeah, so the figures over on the left side of this table are drawn from data that's published by the Department of Revenue Administration. The New Hampshire Department of Revenue Administration doesn't provide information on individual taxpayers. As a result, we base our analyses, which is based all the way on the left side of this column. We base our analysis on the information that we have available from Revenue Administration. And these buckets, if you will, these categorizations of here's how many taxpayers paid $10,000 or more in interest and dividend income tax, how many paid $100,000 or more, how many paid 500 or more. Right? These are based on what is published by the Department of Revenue Administration. So we are extrapolating, but working within the confines of what they make available to the public in aggregated form. Again, we aren't looking at the individual tax returns, just like with the business taxes. We don't know which entities are paying what amount in tax because of confidentiality and privacy concerns there. But we are able to learn some things from what the Department of Revenue Administration has available, and that's what we've tried to extrapolate for you. We've extrapolated from that to try and help you understand what the interest and dividends tax is actually taxing.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. I know we had more questions we weren't able to get to, but really appreciate your time and everyone joining us. Phil, thank you as always. You do an incredible job of synthesizing these complex issues. Thank you. A special thank you to Molly and Emily, who do a great job behind the scenes to make sure this runs flawlessly. So thank you. And as we close out today, just want to thank you again for joining us and hope to see you in June. Have a great rest of the day, everyone.